There we go. Okay. Welcome to everyone on this really, really cold and snowy Martin Luther King Jr. Day evening. My name is Dana Ripper. I'm with the Missouri River Bird Observatory. Our mission is the conservation of birds and their habitats and all wildlife and environmental quality, as you'll see, via science, education, and advocacy. We at MRBO have put together this webinar series to hopefully inspire folks to learn more and to take action about various issues around conservation. And if you weren't able to tune in for last week's webinar, it is on YouTube. Ethan and I discussed, we tried to answer some questions about how all of these topics in the webinar series relate to bird conservation. And they are all related to that, but also to healthy ecosystems and ultimately human health as well, because everything is connected. And so I want to introduce my MRBO co-director, Ethan Duke, that I think wants to set us on with a word.
Just a brief word to mark today as a great historic and current contemporary holiday. Dr. King helped sow the seeds for the modern environmental justice movement, and through that understanding of everything is connected. So I hope you all enjoy celebrating this day in the way that it means something to you and means something, would have meant something to Dr. King.
We are very, very happy to have Charles Miller with us tonight. I'd like to read you his bio before I turn the whole thing over to him. For the past 2 years, Charles has been the policy manager at Missouri Confluence Waterkeeper, working on regulatory and legislative strategies to defend Missourians' rights to swimmable, fishable, drinkable water. In 2021, he was recognized nationally with the Emerging Leader Award from River Network. In 2024, he will be returning to his roots in Alabama, but has been laying the groundwork for Waterkeeper's work in the Missouri Legislature during the 2024 session. Charles clerked or interned with Southern Environmental Law Center, Black Warrior Riverkeeper, American Rivers, and the EPA's Office of Criminal Enforcement, Forensics, and Training. He holds a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Alabama School of Law and a BA in Political Science from Alabama, as well as a Master's Certificate in Nonprofit Management from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Just on a note personal to us at MRBO, we're sorry to see Charles go. He's many of our go-to guy for policy information in Missouri, especially interpretation, which sometimes can be really difficult. So we're really happy to have him here tonight. And Charles, please take it away.
Thanks, Dana. So yeah, as Dana mentioned, my name is Charles Miller, and I'm going to be giving you a little bit of a preview of what we can kind of count on happening, or in some cases not happening, in that building right there, our state capitol, this year during the legislative session. So just a little background on the Capitol here. If you haven't been, you should definitely go. It's a beautiful building, and we're really lucky in Missouri to have a like actual working Capitol, because not every state has that. So this was built in like the early 20th century. It's got a lot of great like murals and engravings and stuff, and it's also just got a beautiful site right above the Missouri River in Jefferson City. So this is the south-facing side of the building. If you were looking through the building here, you would see the Missouri River. And I can only imagine how incredible that view is right now with all the ice and everything. But it's really incredible building, great views. I've seen like bald eagles out over the river. So that's just my plug to like actually go and participate yourself in some of these. And I'll give you some tips on how to do that as we go through the presentation. So, there we go. So first of all, just some thank yous to some folks. Obviously, big thank you to Dana and Ethan and MRBO for having me here to talk about this today. And you know, something else you'll see as we kind of go through here, and then we get to the end, and I talk about some of these resources that some of these organizations offer, is this is also like a real handy list of kind of all of the big environmental groups that do advocacy work in Missouri on some level. So Missouri Coalition for the Environment and Missouri Sierra Club both kind of cover everything, air, land, water, etc. I've worked really closely with Michael Berg, the political director at Sierra Club, and Melissa Vatterott, the policy director at MCE, as well as their lobbyist, Dawn Nicholas. Missouri Stream Teams, hi Mary, I saw you were on the call. They work specifically on water issues, just like Waterkeeper does. And SRAP, Socially Responsible Agriculture Project, they're actually a national organization that's really focused on kind of the intersection of, the health of our agricultural system and the health of our environment. Some local groups there, Montauk County Neighbors Alliance, and some other folks who I also saw were on the call, Doug Doty and Cheryl Markham. All of those people have been really helpful to me as somebody who came to Missouri not knowing that much about it, certainly not knowing anything about what's going on in the State House generally before I moved up here. So those people have really been responsible for a lot of what I've been able to do and what Waterkeeper's been able to do over the past 2 years here. Dana covered a lot of this on the next slide, but I do want to just touch a few things. And I'm also like a real sucker for like audience participation. So I'm gonna ask, and just put it in the chat if you do know, and you can answer this like as broadly or specifically as you can, but does anybody know what that is a picture of on this slide, that big statue? And I'll wait just a few minutes here to see if anybody does know. And it's got some weird kind of personal significance to that. So. And while I'm waiting for this, I'll kind of run through this. I think Dana covered pretty much all of my kind of credentials there, but I do want to also kind of add in some some just kind of like framework stuff, because I think everybody who does advocacy work comes at it from a certain position. Everybody has its biases, and I kind of want to like lay mine out there. Partially because I think you guys like deserve to know that, and second of all, because I'm pretty confident that I'm right. So I'm not too worried about laying my biases out there so that you guys can like evaluate my background and like how I'm looking at this. So like Dana said, I have a law degree. I'm from Alabama. I grew up there. And there's a lot of political similarities, but there's a lot of like environmental differences between Missouri and Alabama. So sometimes I might have a little bit of an emphasis on something that maybe it was like a bigger deal in Alabama than here. There's actually a bill that I think is a really good bill in the Missouri Legislature this year that I think is that I seem to place a lot of importance on that I haven't seen maybe as much importance, especially among our legislators. For some reason it just doesn't click with them, but it's been a big issue in Alabama for a long time. So I'll say that till then. So I do have that background and that bias from just being where I'm from. So I also believe that government can do good things, and especially state government can do good things, and that state government can be responsive to citizens. That's just kind of like a baseline for what I do, right? And I, despite the fact that I'm somebody who gets paid to do this, who gets paid to talk to legislators, who has, spent a bunch of money to go to law school, I don't think that ability to interact and that ability to influence should be limited to people like me. I think the system works better when people like you, who are interested in this kind of stuff and who have your own thoughts and your own personal experiences, share those with your legislators. All right, so I got a bunch of people who said Vulcan, which is correct. Somebody really impressed me, and I'll have to go back here in the chat. Sean Tracy said that's a statue from Birmingham that's associated with steel. That's exactly right. The real connection for me, Missouri, Alabama, and St. Louis here is that this statue was built in Birmingham. It's the world's largest cast iron statue. It's a Vulcan, or somebody said the Roman name, or the Roman name, or the Greek name, I think, Hephaestus, the god of the forge. And it was supposed to show off Birmingham's steelmaking abilities. And they made it for the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, which is where I am right now. And then after it was done at the exhibition, it went back to Alabama, and now it's on top of this big mountain. I can see it from my house. It's incredible. So much like Vulcan, I was made in Alabama. I came here for a little while, and now I went back. So that's kind of my personal connection to the statute. All right, so I'm going to lay a little bit of groundwork. I don't like to assume that folks know all the ins and outs of how a legislature works, or kind of, I know we can all use a refresher on stuff like this. So the schoolhouse rock there, we're going to go through that just kind of real quick. There's three branches of government in the state, just like there are at the federal level. The legislature are the ones who make the law for the most part. The judiciary interprets it, and the executive branch carries the law out. So the legislative branch is it's the first branch, they call it. And it is supposed to be the one that's the most responsive to you, the citizens and the community members. So it's really important. And one thing that's really important about the legislature versus like the judiciary or the executive is because they're making the laws, they can kind of do whatever they want, within the confines of our state and federal constitutions. So Dana mentioned I did regulatory work up here with DNR as well. I can make arguments to DNR, but if the law doesn't allow DNR to do it, they can't do what I'm asking. The legislature, they can change the law. So that's a really powerful place to, get good things to happen, or occasionally it's a really powerful place for people who are opposed to environmental protection to get bad things to happen. And once a bill has been passed out of the legislature, to a large extent, the genie's kind of out of the hat or out of the bottle. So that's why legislative advocacy is really important, both from like a professional sense for me and for those of us who care about Missouri's environment, but also I think for people who want to engage in that kind of advocacy world themselves. I think it's also kind of a lower barrier to entry, right? Generally speaking, if you want to go to DNR, you're going to have to write some like heavy duty stuff and do a lot of research. If you go to the legislature, you can make an impact just with what you already know a lot of times, because odds are, especially if it's something that you've thought about or cared about for a long time, you may know more than a legislator does about it, or you may know something that they don't that could influence their world. So all that just a plug to say the legislature is very important, but legislation is complicated. You can see that flow chart there on the right. I'm not going to go through all of that. I'm going to go kind of do a quick and dirty version of how it usually works and kind of how things can happen. So bills generally start out on a legislator's desk. They introduce a bill that can come from a lot of places, really. Some legislators write their own legislation, some don't. In fact, one of the bad bills we'll talk about later is something that I know the person who's introduced it this year didn't write, because a different legislator introduced it last year. So that was probably written by one of the other sources of legislation, lobbyists. And I was a registered lobbyist in 22 and 23 in Missouri. I don't think lobbyist should be a dirty word, but I can see why people think it is, because a lot of them are not the most scrupulous people. But anyway, so lobbyists sometimes have some influence over that. And also in the state capitol, they have a law library, and they have some professionals and some students who sometimes a legislator will come to them and say, look, I'm a farmer, I'm a realtor, I'm a non-legal expert, or even maybe I don't know about this area of the law. I want to do this. Write a bill that does this for me. And you can kind of you can get good bills out of that. You can get bad bills out of that. The quality is kind of like all over the place. But all that to keep in mind that the legislator that's sponsoring a bill may not have, and in a lot of cases probably didn't write the actual legislation. So they do introduce it, however, if that bill is something that a legislator can convince one of the party leaders or the chamber leaders is a useful piece of legislation that should advance, then it can get a hearing before a committee. And something that's really great about the Missouri legislature, again, I'm just going to keep saying, you guys got to go there. You guys got to go there. One of the things that's really great about the Missouri Legislature is that every bill gets a public hearing. That's not the case in every state. In Alabama, that's not true. If our session starts in February down there, and in February, if something comes up and I want to get the ear of a legislator, I'm going to have to call them. I'm going to have to email them. I'm probably going to have to do it multiple times because they're busy people. And I'm not going to have the opportunity to like write out all of my thoughts or to speak uninterrupted for 5 minutes at a stretch to them, to let them know my thoughts. And here we have just by right, you can do that. You can sign up to testify before a committee when a bill is being heard before that committee. Generally with citizens, they don't ask too many questions. They can't ask you questions, which can be a little scary. But like I said, generally with citizens, they're certainly not gonna rake you over the coals like they might do me or somebody else. So you can do that. On the House side, so in the House, they're having a hearing on a bill in that chamber. You can actually submit written testimony online, so you don't even have to go. The Senate used to have that during COVID. They've done away with it, I think. But you can still send your testimony in an email to the legislators on that committee, and that may get their attention as well. So let's say that the bill you went and testified for, the bill you sent an email to legislators about, passed out of the committee. Well, then it goes maybe to the floor of the legislature, and it'll sit there on a calendar for a while. It depends. It just depends kind of on what the leadership of the chamber wants to do with the bill. If it's a priority for them and it passed out of committee, maybe it'll be on the floor in like a week or two. If it's not something they want to pass, maybe it'll just sit there until the end of the session and never be brought up for a vote. But if it gets a vote in one chamber, and it passes, then it goes to the other chamber and they have to vote on it and they have to reconcile all the little differences, and it's kind of a repeat of the same process. There may not necessarily be committee hearings on that side, but it can go straight to the floor. And if they pass the House and the Senate, they go to the governor. And this is one little thing that I do want to highlight that is a difference between Missouri and Congress at the federal level, is we have the line item veto, which is not something I'm in love with, because I think a lot of legislative work is about compromise, right? And you might get something stuck in there as a legislator as a kind of trade for leaving something in or not fighting something super hard that you weren't wild, right? And the line item veto just allows the governor to say, okay, here's the whole bill. Okay, I like this, I like this, I like this. I don't like this. We're taking that out. And that might have been something, if you're a legislator, that could have been something you fought for a week. And so I think it kind of impinges on the legislature's power a little bit. And then the other thing that is a little bit different about the state legislature versus Congress is we have term limits here. And I don't like term limits. We'll get into why that is in a little bit. So we talked about the executive branch, and they kind of implement the laws. So yes, Shirley, that is only for the appropriations bills. So that's thank you for raising that point. Yeah, that is just for the budget bills. So sorry, I left that part out, but yes, that's accurate. But that allows them to change the budgets of these agencies that we're talking about here, and kind of redirect the priorities in such a way that maybe, align more closely with the governor's values than the legislature's. And again, budget bills are like a lot of work. It's something I try not to get involved with because it's so much work. So again, I think the whole issue with line item vetoes is like weird to me. I don't like it. But anyway, so these executive agencies get some of that money from the state to do their jobs, and they enforce and they implement the laws that the legislature passed. Some of these guys have what they call legislative liaisons. They don't like to really step out and say like, hey, this is a great bill or this is a bad bill, but they do try to represent the interests of the agency. The big one that we deal with in the environmental side in Missouri is the Department of Natural Resources, or DNR. DNR are the ones who issue all of our air, water, and solid waste permits. So they're kind of the environmental agency for Missouri. They're kind of the state equivalent of EPA. Conservation Department does some good stuff. I love a lot of the reports they put out. They don't really have a lot of regulatory authority, so you won't see a lot of legislation focused on them, but they do have a lot of really good information. And quite frankly, I use a lot of their reports or their data when I'm like thinking about legislation, the impacts it might have. So we kind of went over most of this. This is kind of like a little more detail about what folks who do this professionally do. But none of this is anything that you can't do, right? Again, you can submit written testimony or appear in person before a committee if they're hearing a bill that you have an interest in. And that, again, that interest is like up to you. You don't have to prove to them like, oh, this impacts me this way. It's literally just like, do I want to make my voice heard? I can go up there. For us, one of the major things is building relationships with legislators. The legislature is like a very kind of relationally based place to do work. It's like office politics gone absolutely mad because it's real politics. And so sometimes weird things will happen because of those relationships, but the more you know somebody, the more likely it is you can figure out, what's going to happen beforehand, or maybe who you need to talk to make one certain specific thing happen or not happen. And another thing, and again, I'll share some resources here at the end that's really important to, I think, anybody kind of knowing what's going on in the legislature or anyone who wants to make their voice heard is knowing what other people who have similar interests are doing. And in some cases, when it's a really important issue, like literally getting organized and maybe even starting your own group. There was some really, really passionate testimony that I heard last year. It was a hearing that I didn't testify at, but it was a little outside of my expertise and I didn't really have a lot to say, but I did want to see what was going on. It involved a silica mine down in southeast Missouri. And there were some folks who happened to own land around there, lived around there, and many of them lived there for generations. And so they got together and they started a group to fight the silica mine. And again, these people, they're just everyday people. They just happened to live around there and they didn't like it. And they came up and gave some of the best testimony I saw last session. So it really is possible to make a difference. The committee, did what they wanted to. They voted that bill out of committee to the floor to try to prevent that silica mine from coming in. And as far as I know, I don't know if that legislation passed, but I know that silica mine's not operating right now. So you really can make a difference, especially if there's something that's a big deal to like you and your neighbors. And really all you got to do is go up there and say, this is important to me. And we're the people who elect you. Kathleen asked what made their testimony so good. A lot of it was really, I remember this one gentleman who's an older gentleman, and he talked about how this land had been in his family for generations. He talked about kind of everything he saw just on a day-to-day basis on this land. He mentioned, I think he was maybe like 5 or 10 miles upstream from the Mississippi River, and there were bald eagles that would fly over the creek on his property. And for those of you who may not know, I mean, there's bird observatory people, so I'm sure you do, but the eagles tend to hang out around the big rivers because it's better eating and stuff like that. So if you have bald eagles that are kind of away from the river, that's showing you've got like some really healthy streams and creeks and ecosystems in that area. So that just made like a huge impression on me. And again, that was something I would never have known about this guy's creek. Even Missouri Department of Conservation reports aren't going to include that stuff. So that guy had really valuable information that the members of the committee needed to know. And, I'm sure it was intimidating for him to go up there because it's a weird kind of setting. You like sit down in this chair and you're surrounded in a semicircle by the legislators. But he went up there, he shared what he knew. And at least for me, and it seemed to for the legislators on that committee, it made an impression on them. So, again, I really want to underscore, if you take one thing away from this whole presentation, it's that you can do something to change legislators' minds. And if you can change legislators' minds, then you can help change the law or stop the law from being changed. And yeah, Sean, that was the mine down near Holland State Park. So we'll do a broad little preview of kind of what to expect out of the legislature this year. It's an election year, and this is where I'll touch on why I don't particularly like term limits. Missouri, we have like really short term limits, so everybody's kind of thinking about the next step they're going to take, because they're going to have to get, if they want to continue to be a politician, they're going to have to get elected to a higher office within 8 years. So they're kind of in this constant campaign, and especially in an election year that can create some incentives that might not be the best. It can make people do kind of silly things to get attention. It can maybe change some of the relationships between legislators, right? You know, you've got legislators on opposite sides of the aisle who might meet in a general election, and then you have legislators on the same side of the aisle, Republicans or Democrats, that know they're going to be running against the guy who sits 2 seats over from them, or the woman who sits, 1 seat in front of them. And they're thinking, well, I don't want them to get a bill passed, or what do I do to make myself look better than them? And I don't know, that's, for me at least, that's not why we should be passing legislation. It's good, and I'm very happy to give credit where credit is due when good legislation happens. But we should be passing good legislation because it's good, not because it makes somebody look good. So that's kind of my pitch against term limits. But that's my personal opinion. And so that's kind of be the backdrop for the legislature this year. Is there's going to be people who are thinking about their next step in their political career, and there's going to be a lot of like kind of inter-party fighting sometimes, especially on the Senate side among Republicans, and that's kind of been a feature of the Missouri Senate for a few years now. And I think it's only going to get worse this year. And what that means is, bottom line, it's going to be really hard to get stuff passed. And that means a lot of the good bills that we're going to talk about might not have a great chance of passing this year. But on the other side, it means the bills that are not so great are going to be easier to fight. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. And as I mentioned, lots of bills have been filed already. We're in like the second week of session, and I think there's already over 3,000 bills in the House, which is an astronomical number. But very few of those bills are going to pass. Ethan says almost 600 Senate bills, which is, that's also a really high number. But very few of those bills are going to pass. We passed less than 100 bills last session that weren't related to the budget, and that's real rough, because again, that means good things aren't happening. But at the same time, like I mentioned, it means bad things aren't happening. So I have a kind of personal way of categorizing bills, and it's into like these 3 buckets: the good, the bad, and the ugly. And let's give a quick run through of kind of what I think, how I think about that, right? So a good bill is something that I could support, doesn't need a lot of changes to pass, that doesn't need a lot of changes to, be a positive bill, may not need any changes at all. And that's something like I could support and certainly not stand in the way of. A bad bill is not awful, but it's something that needs some changes maybe to make it something that I would say either like personally or professionally we could support. I'll give some examples of these bills. We're going to go through the whole list. It's something, like maybe it's got a good intent, but it's just not written quite right, or maybe there's just like one thing that's particularly bad for one issue, but it doesn't really touch anything else that's important to us. If like you took that one bad thing out, I could live with it. That's a bad bill. A bad bill is a bill that could become a good bill, basically. And then ugly bills are bills that just suck. Bills that are just unfixable, maybe they've got like a really bad intent. Maybe they were, and this is very rare, maybe they were so poorly written that they just can't be fixed. But 9 times out of 10, if you see a bill that's like that I would consider an ugly bill, it's because it wants to do something that I think is bad. So I like to start off on a positive note. So we'll start with the good bills this session. And I'm going to give credit where credit is due on the good bills. So I've got everybody's name up there in terms of who's filed these bills. And the first one is something that's been a major concern in the northern part of the state near Macon. There's been a lot of public hearings about this company called Denali, who's come in and built this enormous, they call it a lagoon, but it's just a big earthen berm surrounding a pit, basically. And what Denali does is they take waste from slaughterhouses, CAFOs, industrial agriculture, municipalities, just like anybody who produces any kind of waste, they'll take it, basically. And what they put in these so-called lagoons, these big pits, good question, Kristen. These are bills that are current for this session. So nothing is passed. I think the bill I'm talking about right now, Representative Lewis's bill on waste sludge, I think it's had a committee hearing. I know one of the other bills has had a committee hearing already, and I don't know that any bills have passed out of committee yet because we're still really super early in the session. But back to Representative Lewis's bill, it would kind of create some new regulations for this stuff that you may have heard referred to as biosolids or waste sludge. That's really just a kind of disgusting mix of all kinds of trash and gore and just nasty stuff. It would create some monitoring requirements around these sites. There's some, like I mentioned, there's this Denali company that was building one up in around Macon, Missouri. There's one that was being constructed down, and I think was filled, and I think it was the same company. I think it was Denali down in southwestern Missouri where they had some issues. And this would increase monitoring around those areas so that we know what's happening there. I mean, the issue with taking all these different kinds of waste and storing them together and putting them together is that we don't really know what's in them, right? And so we don't know what kind of impact it's going to have on our rivers and streams or our groundwater. So Representative Lewis's bill would put in place, the ability for DNR to monitor around those sites and get a sense of, one, how safe they are and how contained this waste is, and two, give us a kind of heads up if some of this really nasty stuff is escaping into the environment. So I think that's great. The one thing I would change, just one thing I would change, is it says DNR may conduct that monitoring. I would like it to be mandatory. I would like to have DNR has to do monitoring around the sites. But beyond that, it's fantastic. The next one is a water export bill. Right now, we don't have any limits on water export in the state. If somebody wants to come buy water, groundwater, surface water, anything from somebody who owns that water or has a right to take that water in the state of Missouri, DNR can't stop them. Nobody can stop them. The only way you could stop them would be if you were somebody who was harmed by that, you could take them to court. But it's a really lengthy process. And so this would just create some ground rules and allow DNR to say, basically, if exporting this water is bad for Missouri, then we're not going to allow it to happen. Other states around us have these laws, and they've had to use them. Iowa had to use it a couple years ago when somebody from California wanted to export water from Iowa so that they could grow almonds in California during a drought. I don't know. My attitude is each state should kind of manage its own water resources in a sustainable way. And if you can't do that, don't come begging to me to fix your problem. So that is a really big issue for me. Again, this is my Alabama bias because we've had all kinds of interstate disputes down there about who can take what water. So I think just having this kind of very basic ability for DNR to say, yes, this is okay, no, this is not okay, is really important to managing our water resources. Water quantity is as important as water quality in a lot of cases. I'm going to just touch on one more here, because I know we're probably going to go over time a little bit, and I apologize for that. Is House Bill 2361. That's from Representative Sauls in the Kansas City area. I think he represents Independence, for those of y'all from Independence on the call. And it would do a couple things. It would allow us to set our own air pollution standards. Right now, we have a rule that says we can't be any stricter than the federal government's air pollution standards. So this would allow the state to, actually go above and beyond those protections, which I think is fantastic. Not particularly related to water, but it is related to stuff like animal agriculture. But more importantly, from the water perspective, it would return a public majority to the Clean Water Commission. The way the Clean Water Commission was supposed to be set up is essentially you have members who represent certain regulated industries or important industries. Like you've got seats reserved for people who do sewage treatment. And I think that's obviously very important, right? Because that's something I don't know a lot about. It's something the average person probably doesn't know a lot about. That requires specialized knowledge. It's got some reserved seats for folks involved in agriculture. Those are typically filled by special interest groups, unfortunately. And the way the law is written right now, the governor can also appoint people to these seats that are supposed to be representing the public that represent similar public interests. And what Representative Saul's bill would do would be eliminate that possibility. The members of the public on the board actually have to represent the public. They can't be somebody whose, cousin is the advocacy director for like Missouri soybeans or something. Stephanie asks in the questions, can we comment on these bills by sending letters to our representatives? Yeah, that's a great idea. And I think one of the best times to do that is if there's a hearing coming up. Because a lot of these bills, we'll talk about some on the ugly side that probably aren't going to move very much, but legislators are probably not going to think a lot about, a bill unless it's quote unquote moving, unless it's going to be before committee or unless it's going to the floor. Chris also asks if our state's able to like kind of undercut some of those federal regulations in terms of like the Clean Water and Clean Air Act. So those federal laws both set the language we always use is it's a floor, not a ceiling. So in other words, you have to do at least this. And you can, in a lot of states, do more than this. And we still have that ability on water in Missouri. We don't have that ability on hazardous waste and air. But Representative Saul's bill seeks to change that at least for air. So again, the whole idea is that states have different things they're dealing with. So states should be able to, set stricter air standards if there's a good reason for them to do so. And again, like I don't know that the legislature are the people who need to be making that decision. So I'd prefer if the Air Commission had the ability to do it. All right, we're going to do some bad bills. There's not very many bad bills, honestly, this year. There's some ugly ones. But, I'll just highlight one here, and that's House Bill 1956. It's really similar to 2134, the bill about those waste lagoons, those waste pits, but it just doesn't go as far. It kind of just says like, if you're going to get a waiver from the fertilizer board to build one of these things, you have to prove that you're actually selling it, which I think will, disrupt that industry a little bit, because one of the ways they get rid of this is they just give this stuff away because it's not very economically valuable. You can imagine that the big pile of pig poop and stuff isn't, the world's most valuable thing that people are willing to pay and then truck out to their land or whatever. But this would only like change that one little thing. It doesn't have any of the monitoring pieces. So like if you gave me both these bills and said one has to pass, I'd go with 2134, the one that establishes the monitoring requirements. And that's kind of a good definition of like the difference between a good and a bad bill, right? Because 2134 just has better things in it. It goes a little bit further and it's a little bit more protective. So, but let's talk about the ugly ones. The one I really, really, really need to talk about is HB 1691 and Senate Bill 981. So these are honestly probably the worst pieces of legislation I've ever seen. And it's really peculiar because it's this one guy who represents some special interests. He's like, he's on this personal crusade um, to do away with Missouri's ability to regulate its own water resources. And I don't get it. But that's what he wants to do. And these bills would essentially say, well, let me back up a little bit. So the groundwork here is in Missouri and in most states, if you are discharging pollution to waters of the state, you have to get a permit. That waters of the state encompasses, you look out Missouri River, big lakes like Lake of the Ozarks. It also includes your kind of smaller streams that feed into those bigger rivers and lakes. And it also includes groundwater. And so you got to get a permit if you want to pollute those. And I think that makes sense, right? Because it allows the Department of Natural Resources to say, all right, we know what it's going to take to keep that water body healthy for what people use it for, whether that's fishing, swimming, drinking water source, whether it's just that's where some fish live and they need clean water. And this would do away with, I want to be very clear, it wouldn't limit the state's ability to control that pollution in certain waters. It wouldn't restrict it. It would do away with it. It would do away with the state's ability to impose permit requirements for anybody who's discharging into groundwater, a lot of these headwater streams, and into wetlands. And again, especially the groundwater piece is just mind-boggling to me, because what you're essentially saying is if you don't have to get a permit, then nobody's going to be checking what you're doing. And it is perfectly legal. And I think groundwater is where this gets really complicated, right? Because groundwater moves in weird ways. It would technically be legal for you to just pump whatever down a well into groundwater, and until somebody's harmed by it, they can't do anything about it. And then once they're harmed, they got to take you to court. And it's wild. It is just wild. Ann Detmer asked in the chat, and I know I said I wasn't going to name names on the but I'll name names here. In the House, 1691 is sponsored by Representative von Schoyak. And then in the Senate, it's sponsored by Senator Black, Rusty Black. And again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, these guys didn't write the language. It's the exact same language in both bills. This is like one guy who's got this weird crusade to just destroy as many protections for water in Missouri as possible and to make as much money as he can for the guys who employ him. And I don't know. There's not enough money in the world for me to do that, and I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I was the one who'd written this. That's how bad it is. It's outrageously bad. Senate Bill 1318 is one of these bills that, kind of like the Second Amendment Protection Act, if you remember, is probably going to be found unconstitutional even if it did pass. But it basically says, does away with all federal regulation on agricultural products in Missouri, which the state can't do constitutionally. And then also just you slap a label on the food and it says, eat at your own risk. And that's it. No more, nobody's checking to see if the milk's pasteurized. Nobody's, making sure that the lettuce has been washed so it's free from E. coli, things like that. So that's just kind of like a wild, weird bill. And that's one of those that I also know is not written by its sponsor because somebody else sponsored it last year. So that's one thing that we'll see every now and again is there's a lot of bad actors that are pushing some of this legislation to legislators. And, frankly, on this one, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. Brenda asks about the Waters of the State bill, what I think the chances of it passing are. What I've been saying to folks is I think cramming all of those three kind of pieces of water together, cramming groundwater, wetlands, and these headwater streams and removing jurisdiction for all three of them at once, I think is a bad strategic move. And I think that really hurts this bill's chances of passing. But my concern is that maybe some of that is stuff that the sponsor is willing to give away. Maybe they really only are going after wetlands protection, or maybe they're only going after groundwater. And so, especially on that bill, because it's just unfixable and it's so bad, and it does seem to have some momentum, that's one I think we have to be really vigilant about. And we have to that's something that your legislators should be hearing about every time it comes up. They should be hearing from you like, hey, do you know that this is basically going to allow people to pollute your groundwater with impunity? It's going to let them do whatever they want on, to wetlands. They can just bulldoze it and pave it over and turn it into a parking lot. I think the consequences of this bill are really outrageous. And so it's easy to talk about why it's so bad, but we've got to talk about why that bill is so bad. In terms of the likelihood of it passing, I really don't know. And again, it's so bad. It's one that I would not want to put money on not passing, because if it does, it's game over for water quality in Missouri. I mean, it is horrible. Like I said, it is probably the worst piece of legislation I have ever read, which is, I've read a lot of legislation. It's really something. There's some other bills there. I won't spend a lot of time on those. Basically, the SB 829 gives incentives to do biodigesters, is what they call them. It's pig poop gas. That's what it is. It's storing methane that comes off of these lagoons of pig poop, and using it as a renewable, clean energy source. It's neither. And it's also just really dangerous to store those kind of flammable materials on a farm and, pump it through pipelines or have it stored somewhere else. It's not the kind of thing you want in your neighbor's backyard or in your backyard or really in your community at all. The other two ones are kind of about administrative rules, and basically everything that you ever see in the Missouri Legislature, if it's making any changes to the administrative process, any changes for like executive branch agencies and what they can do, it's probably a bad bill. And these bills are very bad bills. They're not good. And they would kind of take away a lot of the authority the experts who work at, DNR have to do good things. So another thing that I do want to really underscore for folks is there's always a lot of chatter about stuff, particularly at the federal level, but even at the local and the state level about politics, in, just social media and things like that. And there's a lot of bad information, but it's not so terribly difficult to get some of the good information. And as I see, somebody's already put this first link to the House website in the Q&A, so that's great. If you want to know what's going on, if you want to know the status of a bill, if you want to know whether it's had a hearing yet, when the hearing is scheduled, you can go to the House and the Senate websites and see. I've also included just a couple of links to what I consider some pretty high quality news sources about the legislature and about the environment in Missouri. And that's Missouri Net and Missouri Independent. They give pretty objective stuff. And just as like kind of a rule of thumb, like they always kind of like link to the source, which I find really useful. And I think that's a good rule of thumb. Like if somebody's actually like showing you where the source is and it's coming from the House website or the Senate website, well, then that's a pretty good bet that that's a reputable source. And so I've found that those two websites tend to be pretty good. I've also got a lot of bill trackers here from some of our partner groups. So Sierra Club and Missouri Coalition for the Environment, like I mentioned, they kind of cover everything. And so they've got stuff that's not just related to water, which is kind of my jam, but other environmental topics as well. I think Sierra Clubs in particular casts a really wide net. So there's a lot of really good stuff there that you may not even like think of off the top of your head as being environmental. Stream Teams has their legislative bill tracker as well, and I just got an email this weekend from Mary that has this like action page for those really bad waters that the state bills, and that is so useful because it's going to be something where you can contact your legislators, something where you can see what's happening with these, and get your voice to your legislators in a way that's pretty easy. So those are kind of my go-to sources if you want to just keep up with what's going on. If you're like a real junkie like me, you may want to go to the House and the Senate websites. If you're somebody who's like just kind of interested and like casually want to follow this stuff, then some of the bill trackers from those groups might be a good option. That's my presentation. Sorry, I went probably a little bit over. Let's see. Oh, no, not quite. We've got 6 minutes for questions. Okay, great. So I'm going to answer. There's a few questions already in the chat, and I'm going to answer those. So I'll start with Melanie's question about the Supreme Court decision in a case called Sackett. And this is dangerous because I could talk about this for like 2 hours. It's bad. Anyway, so those two bills that I harped on that are so bad, the waters of the state legislation, that is actually kind of, this is going to sound really harsh, but I think it's true. That is a very legally illiterate response to Sackett, because Sackett was about the EPA's jurisdiction, the federal jurisdiction over water. And while DNR and the EPA do work closely in terms of the Clean Water Act, they're, the framework we always talk about for the Clean Water Act is it's cooperative federalism. So like the states kind of take the lead role and the feds kind of make sure the states are doing what they ought to be doing. But the state jurisdiction and the federal jurisdiction have always been different. And I think there's a lot of confusion and some misinformation. I know there's some misinformation because I've seen it in Clean Water Commission meetings that people are trying to take advantage of to try to tell our state legislators that Sackett, which was about federal jurisdiction, means you have to change state jurisdiction. That's simply not true. They've always been separate. They're authorized by different units of government, the state and our country. They're, state jurisdiction in every state across the country has almost always been more protective than the federal jurisdiction. And again, that's part of what we talked about earlier with the Air Commission regulations. The idea is, especially a state like Missouri is actually a really good example, right? Because we have a lot of gaining and losing streams in the Ozarks. We have a lot of groundwater, surface water interconnectivity. So that requires maybe a different approach than a state like Alabama, which has some, but not as much of that. And it certainly requires a different approach for both of those states than it does a state like Arizona, where they don't have a lot of permanent surface water, but they do have a lot of streams that flow only in response to rainfall. So the idea is we should leave kind of the really detailed aspects like the headwater streams and, groundwater stuff to the states. And part of the deal there is that the state has to have the authority to actually protect those resources. And so the response has been this bill. But I just want to underscore that nothing about what happened in the Supreme Court last year in Sackett forces this to happen. And anybody who's telling you otherwise, and I can think of a handful of people who will, they're wrong. They're just wrong. And so Valerie also asks who would fund the DNR monitoring of those waste sites. I assume that money would probably just come out of the general fund. I don't think there's a funding mechanism listed in that bill. Melissa asked, what's a good way to find out which bills are getting ready to be heard? I use something called Fast Democracy, which is like this little, and they have a free version. I've used the free version in Missouri, um, that allows you to pass or track bills. Um, and you just sign up for an account. You just use your email, create a password, and you can just search. They've got like pre-arranged topics. So they've got like a whole environment section. You can search by keyword. So if you're like me and you're like a water person, and you can just search water. If you're like Dana and Ethan and you're really into bird stuff, you can like look for every bill that mentions birds that's in the session this year, and you can choose which bills to track, and it'll send you an update in your email whenever there's any kind of change. So consider that my plug for Fast Democracy. I think the House and the Senate websites also offer some kind of like limited bill tracking, and you can go there and you can certainly look at the calendar to see what's on uh, the either the full like House calendar that's going to go to the floor for a vote, or you can go to the committee websites on those websites, and you can just see what's coming up next, what's been referred to the committee, and when those hearings are going to be. Sometimes those are on really short notice, so that's why I like Fast Democracy, because it would just tell me, and I wouldn't have to check every day. And yeah, thank you, Ethan, for putting that in the chat there, the link to Fast Democracy. But either way, you can get that information. And again, if you're somebody who really wants to get the information straight from the horse's mouth, then the House and the Senate webpages are probably the best. I think the House webpage is a little bit better than the Senate webpage, but that's just, it's been easy. It's easier for me to work with that one for some reason. I don't know. Steve asks about kind of the membership of the House Natural Resources Committee. I've testified a couple of times before them, and I think they're generally pretty level-headed. I like the chairman, Representative Sassman. He's done a lot of good stuff, especially for like trails in Missouri. And I know that he's somebody who certainly, I think, takes his role as the chair of that committee like seriously. Like he's willing to listen to us as like the green groups, even if we're opposed to something that maybe some really powerful people are pushing. Now, it doesn't always mean he's going to make the right decision in the end, but the fact that he's willing to listen to us and give us time is very meaningful. The ranking member, Representative Brown, on that committee is also, she's very good. I think she's kind of already stepping up and saying, there's no way I'm letting this bad legislation about water to the state pass. So, hopefully she kind of stands her ground on that, and she can bring some folks along with her. But yeah, generally I think it's pretty decent, especially for a state that has a lot of interests that maybe aren't or are opposed to protecting our waters and our natural resources. And also like a state where the kind of like deck is stacked against us in a lot of ways. And then Joe asks kind of what the chance of getting good bills in states like Missouri or Alabama, where there's a Republican supermajority and what we call a Republican trifecta, means they control the House, the Senate, and the governorship. In other words, if they want to get it done, they can get it done, right? What the chance of passing good legislation in states like Missouri and Alabama is. And I've only ever worked in states that have a Republican trifecta, so maybe I have rose-tinted glasses on, but I think it's very possible to get good legislation passed in red states. I think a lot of it's about your pitch. Again, I think that water export legislation that we've got, first of all, that was a new bill last year, and it made it all the way to the floor, which is unheard of. Like bills don't usually move that fast. It's filed 1 year, it kind of sits there, maybe it gets a committee hearing if somebody likes it, but then it probably doesn't pass, and it certainly doesn't make it to the floor. So that's a really good bill, and I think the pitch for that is really easy in Missouri because we're an ag state, and a farmer doesn't want anybody stealing the groundwater out from under him and shipping it to California any more than I want Dasani coming in here and sucking all the groundwater out from underneath a state park or something. So like that's something that's like very common between all of these interest groups. I kind of joked, I testified in favor of the last year, and it was myself, DNR's legislative liaison, and some industrial ag groups actually testified in favor of it. And I kind of joked with them. I was like, this is the only time that all four of us are going to get up and say like, hey, yeah, we love this bill. Let's go. So that's part of it, is like you have to find that common ground. And it does exist. I know, especially on issues where there is kind of this like partisan divide, it's easy to kind of fall into that trap where you think there's nothing you can agree on. But there's always opportunities to do that. A lot of it's about how you frame it, and a lot of it's about just kind of, being confident in your own knowledge. That's something I'll kind of maybe throw the objectivity out the window here for a minute. Like I said, I'm upfront with you guys about my biases because I think I'm right. So I'm okay with you knowing, like, oh yeah, I have a like value system and an ethical system that makes me feel like protecting the environment is important, because it is. And that's a belief that I hold, but it's also one that's backed up by facts. And if you want to challenge me on that, I've got them. So that's another thing, is just be very like, what you know. And, if that's something that's like even if it's something that's not, cold hard data, but it's something that you've seen and you've witnessed anecdotally, that's still like really important. And you should be confident when you're talking to your legislators about that kind of thing. Because again, that guy who was there, he saw a bald eagle and he didn't question. He was like, wow, that's a weird place to see one. I don't, maybe I didn't see a bald eagle. Maybe it was just a weird looking hawk. But no, he said, yeah, I saw a bald eagle up there. It's incredible. It shows that that's a really special place. And so that's kind of, again, like, that's what I want to leave you guys with. It's like, this is not that hard to do. And it's very important, in my opinion, for legislators to hear from you guys. And quite frankly, a lot of them are going to put way, way more stock in what you say or what you tell them's been going on or what you're afraid of than if I come there with a report this thick that they're never going to read. And so, citizens, community members can really make a difference in state legislatures. And I just implore you guys, if there's anything that like you're interested in, send them an email. Heck, if it's something that, again, is really close to your heart, go testify. Bring two of your friends. And you, believe it or not, you can make a difference. So I think, let me double check. Okay. I don't think we got anything else in the Q&A. And I've already taken 7 more minutes of your time than I need to. So all my info is right there. I'm certainly going to continue working on a volunteer basis with some of the groups up here on that really bad legislation. So I'll be paying attention to that. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, which I refuse to call X. And I try to share a lot of information there about, like, water issues more broadly, ones that are not specific to Alabama or Missouri necessarily. But you can always reach out to me via email as well. And yeah, I gotta say thank you again to Ethan and Dana, and honestly to everybody here in Missouri. I did have a really good time. This was like one of my first lobbying jobs, so it's been a real pleasure to kind of learn the ropes here. And again, like, a lot of the folks here, both professionally and personally, have really helped me a lot in the past couple of years I've been here. So that's all I got.
Thanks, our friend. That was awesome. I had a bunch
Yeah,
of
it's great.
questions written down, but you really covered them all. So, and there's lots of thanks in the chat. So we'll bid you all a good night, and Charles, we'll be in touch about bad
Yeah.
bills and maybe other good stuff.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank
Take
you,
care,
Charles.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Stay warm, y'all.